They had been told a story, one repeated so often that it settled into their bones, that America was weak, a land of greed, chaos, and cruelty, a nation too spoiled to fight and too divided to win. For years, that story was the shield that let them march across deserts and mountains under a burning flag. It gave meaning to hunger, to loss, to the sound of artillery that never stopped. But stories are fragile things, and sometimes a single journey can break them apart. It was the spring, 1943. Rommel's once proud Africa Corps had crumbled in the sands of Tunisia. Thousands of young German soldiers, barely men, had surrendered to Allied troops. Exhausted, sunburnt, their uniforms stiff with dust, they were herded into makeshift pens under the blinding African sun. Most believed their lives were over. Some prayed for capture by the British, fearing the unknown hands of the Americans. Rumors drifted like desert wind through the ranks. The Americans shoot prisoners. They starve you, beat you, make you dig your own graves. Each version darker than the last, each whispered as if to prepare the mind for what the body could not bear. Among them was Hans Keller, 23, a farm boy from Bavaria who had left home with the faith that Germany would triumph in months. Beside him, Karl Weiss, older by 2 years, quieter, cautious, a soldier who trusted orders but not promises. They had fought together, surrendered together, and now waited together beneath a foreign sky that offered neither mercy nor meaning. When the trucks arrived, engines roaring over the sand, no one knew where they were going. Some said Egypt, others said a labor camp in Britain. But when word spread that the destination was America, disbelief rippled through the crowd. Across the ocean, it sounded impossible. America was another planet. For days they were moved from camp to camp, stripped of weapons, badges, and illusions. They watched Allied guards, young men their age, faces open and suntanned, share cigarettes, laugh, and treat them not with hatred but with procedure. It was confusing. The enemy was supposed to snarl, not smile, but suspicion clung harder than sand. Politeness, they told themselves, was only the first step of cruelty. The journey began at a port crowded with Liberty ships, steel giants built faster than belief. Hans had never seen anything like them. Rows of hulls stretching to the horizon. Cranes swinging above decks, soldiers and sailors moving with practiced rhythm. Even defeat couldn't quiet his awe. America, it seemed, built everything bigger, even the vessels that carried its enemies. They were marched aboard in silence. Boots clanged on metal steps, the smell of oil and salt thick in the air. Below, deck hammocks were strung in tight rows, so close that turning in one meant disturbing 3 others. The air was heavy, the light dim. For many, this was the first time they understood what captivity truly meant. Not the loss of battle, but the loss of sky. When the engines rumbled to life, conversation fell away. The Atlantic waited outside, vast and indifferent. Some men crossed themselves. Others whispered to the dark. Hans pressed his palm to the cold steel wall and felt the vibration run through it like a heartbeat. He thought of his mother's garden, of the smell of soil after rain. He wondered if he would ever feel it again. The first days blurred together. Heat, noise, the endless motion of the sea. Seasickness spread fast. Buckets overflowed. Tempers flared. Sleep came in fragments, broken by the groan of the ships. Hull and the shout of guards checking below. No one spoke of home anymore, only of survival. But there were moments, small, almost invisible, when the shape of the lie began to change. Meals, though plain, were filling, soup thick enough to taste, bread that wasn't moldy. An American guard, barely older than Hans, tossed down a pack of cigarettes and said only, "Share 'em." No threats, no laughter, just a gesture. For the prisoners, it was bewildering. This wasn't how the enemy behaved in the stories they'd been told. Still, the fear lingered. Every sound above deck could be danger. They knew German U-boats hunted these same waters. Irony was cruel. They could die at the hands of their own navy, torpedoed in chains. Each night when the convoy changed course, the engines shifted tone, a mechanical sigh that echoed through the hold. Men lay awake counting the seconds between waves, waiting for the explosion that never came. Days turned into weeks. The sea, outside, was invisible but ever-present, a heartbeat of distance between the life they'd lost and the world they were sailing toward. Hans began to measure time by sound, the clatter of trays, the cough of engines, the rhythm of boots overhead. Carl spoke little, conserving words like rations. When he finally did, his voice was rough from silence. "If they feed us now," he said, "it is only so we last longer for their work." Hans wanted to agree. It was easier than hope, but something in the guard's earlier gesture, a cigarette shared without reason, stuck with him. He didn't say it aloud, but the thought returned. What if the stories were wrong? As the voyage stretched on, fatigue dulled even fear. Men began to hum old songs, quiet and tuneless, the kind their mothers sang when they were boys. It was not courage that kept them calm, but exhaustion. They were too tired to hate, too tired to believe. Then one morning, the engine slowed. A change in the air, crisp cold, smelling faintly of smoke instead of salt. The ship's horn sounded once, long and deep. Above deck, footsteps hurried. Voices shouted orders, excitement threading through the English words. Hans looked up at the faint light leaking through the hatch. For the first time in weeks, it was bright. Someone whispered the word, "land." A ripple passed through the hold. Hands clenched, eyes lifted, hearts tightened. For better or worse, their journey was ending. They had sailed through fear, through sickness, through silence. They had been told they were crossing into darkness. But as the sunlight spilled down the stairwell, cutting through dust and breath, something else filled the air. Curiosity. None of them knew what waited beyond that hatch. Chains or mercy, cruelty or decency. All they knew was that the lies they'd lived on were cracking, and the truth, whatever it was waiting just beyond the steel. The desert was never quiet. Even when the guns fell silent, the wind still hissed across the dunes, whispering over burned machines and broken helmets. In the spring of 1943, that wind carried the sound of a dying army. For nearly 2 years, Rommel's Afrika Korps had fought the British and the Americans across the sands, an army of dust and discipline. They had believed themselves unbeatable, guided by the legend of the Desert Fox, sustained by the illusion of purpose. But illusions die the way men do, slowly, then all at once. By May, supply lines had collapsed. German tanks sat stranded, half buried in sand. Fuel drums were empty, canteens rattled with their last drops. Every horizon looked the same, blinding light, distant smoke, and the promise of defeat. In scattered pockets, soldiers waited for orders that never came. The radio crackled only with surrender notices and static. When the Allied columns closed in from the coast, resistance was little more than ritual. White cloths rose on rifles, weapons clattered to the ground. Tens of thousands of German and Italian troops were marched into improvised camps, desert enclosures fenced with barbed wire that glowed red under the sun. The prisoners squinted at their captors, Americans in loose khaki uniforms laughing, passing canteens among themselves, as if this were no more than another exercise. To the defeated, their ease felt like mockery. Hans Keller watched an American Jeep roll past, a radio playing jazz through its open door. The music was bright, careless, full of life. It made no sense. How could an enemy sound so alive when he himself felt hollow? Karl Weiss muttered beside him, "They don't know war, not the real kind." Hans nodded, but he wasn't sure anymore. What the real kind was. Days stretched into weeks beneath the African sun. The prisoners slept in shallow trenches, wrapped in blankets stiff with sand. Flies found every wound. Hunger gnawed quietly. Yet even here, small details unsettled the stories they'd been told. The American guards brought water more often than expected. They organized medical tents, treated wounds, and spoke without venom. There were jokes in English that no one understood, but their tone wasn't cruel. It was almost ordinary. Still, fear was a stubborn companion. Every rumor found purchase in exhausted minds. Some claimed that selected prisoners were being shipped to mines in Alaska, where they would freeze and vanish. Others whispered about camps where men were forced to dig until they collapsed. In the flicker of campfires, those tales grew monstrous. No one had seen America, but everyone thought they knew what it looked like. Endless factories, smoke, greed, and cruelty behind a smiling mask. When the trucks arrived, the uncertainty hardened. Into dread, rows of prisoners climbed aboard under the watch of guards who rarely raised their voices, but never lowered their rifles. Engines started, coughing black smoke. The convoy wound toward the coast, dust trailing behind like a funeral shroud. At night, under a sky vast enough to swallow nations, Hans watched the silhouettes of ships waiting offshore. Their lights blinked like stars that had fallen into the sea. He thought of the posters he'd seen back in Munich, cartoons of American soldiers grinning with animal teeth, carrying money bags instead of rifles. He remembered his instructor's words. They fight for profit, not for honor. Now he wondered if honor and defeat were perhaps closer cousins than he'd been taught. On the docks, the sound was overwhelming. Cranes groaning, cables snapping taut, shouts in half a dozen accents. The sea smelled of oil and iron. One by one, the prisoners were herded up the gangways of Liberty ships, each step clanging like a verdict. Hans hesitated for a heartbeat at the threshold, feeling the deck vibrate beneath his boots. Beyond that deck lay the Atlantic, and beyond the Atlantic, the land that propaganda had called a monster. Carl leaned close and whispered, "Remember what they told us. America ist grausam. America is cruel." Hans nodded, though his stomach told him otherwise. It twisted not from fear, but from confusion. As the ships pulled away, the shoreline of Africa shrank into a blur of yellow and gray. Some men watched until it vanished. Others turned their backs, unwilling to see what they'd lost. The wind off the sea was cooler than the desert air, almost gentle. It carried no judgment, only distance. Below deck, the prisoners found hammocks, waiting, food laid out, guards stationed with quiet authority. No jeering, no beatings, just order. That too was unnerving. The enemy, it seemed, preferred control to cruelty. Hans lay awake that night listening to the pulse of the engines. Each throb felt like a heartbeat too large for the world he knew. Somewhere above, an American sailor hummed along with the radio. Another jazz tune, light and reckless. It drifted down through the vents like something from another planet. He thought of home again. The church bell in his village, the hills after rain. And for the first time, the memory didn't comfort him. It felt far away, unreal, like a story, told to a child. When dawn came, he whispered to Carl, "If what they told us was wrong about their cruelty, what else was wrong?" Carl didn't answer. He simply stared at the thin line of horizon where sea met sky and said, "We'll know soon enough." Behind them, the desert wind still blew across empty trenches. Ahead, the Atlantic waited, deep and endless, ready to carry them toward a truth they could neither imagine nor escape. The Atlantic was not kind. It stretched farther than the prisoner's imagination, a gray wilderness that seemed to have no end. Each day began and ended in the same dull light, the same salt-stained air, the same uneasy rhythm of engines beating. Beneath their feet, down below, time lost its shape. There were no clocks, no sky, no distance, only the slow rocking that lulled some men into uneasy dreams and made others sick until their stomachs were empty. The hold stank of sweat, diesel, and despair. Hammocks swayed like pendulums, their occupants whispering, coughing, muttering half-prayers in the dark. Hans learned to mark the passing hours by sound. Boots above meant the guards changing shift. A clatter of metal trays meant food, beans, bread, and sometimes a spoon of jam that felt like luxury. Every few days, the hatch would open for air, and sunlight would pour in like an invasion, dazzling eyes that had grown used to gloom. Men reached up to it instinctively, as though sunlight itself were freedom. The voyage was supposed to be 10 days. It stretched beyond 2 weeks. The convoy zigzagged constantly, wary of U-boats prowling the Atlantic lanes. Even in chains, the prisoners understood the irony. Their greatest fear now came from their own navy. Every time the ship changed course, abruptly someone whispered, "Torpedo." The word froze conversation. At night, the sea was a black void. No lights, no moon. Just the faint glow of a cigarette from a careless guard or a sailor on watch. When the wind shifted, it moaned through the vents like distant voices. Some men claimed they could hear music above deck. Others said it was only the sea mocking them. On the fifth night, a storm found them. The ship heaved like a living thing, metal shrieking as waves crashed over the bow. Hammocks snapped, men fell, buckets spilled. For hours, no one spoke. There was only the roar of water and the groan of steel. Hans clung to the railing of his bunk, tasting bile and salt, certain that death was finally coming. Not from bullets, but from the ocean itself. When morning came, the storm had passed, but its echo stayed in their bodies. They moved slower, spoke less, as though something inside them had cracked and would never quite fit again. Yet amid the fear, moments of grace appeared, fragile, but real. An American guard, red-haired, freckled, barely 20, lowered a bucket of fresh water into the hold after the storm. He said nothing, only gestured for them to drink slowly. That small act of decency spread through the prisoners like warmth. No one had expected kindness from the enemy, and that made it powerful. Hans shared the bucket with Carl, who looked skeptical even as he drank. "They're playing with us," Carl muttered. Hans didn't reply. The water tasted clean, sweeter than any lie he'd been told. Days blurred again. Some men began to sing softly, old songs from Bavaria and the Rhineland, melodies about home and fields and rivers. The tunes wove through the stale air, gentle reminders of the world they had lost. Even the guards stopped shouting when they heard them. Hans noticed more now. The way the Americans worked, calm and efficient. No panic, no cruelty. When one prisoner fainted from heat, a guard called for a medic instead of kicking him. They weren't friendly, not exactly, but their indifference was humane. It was the first time Hans realized that mercy could come without affection, that respect didn't need to speak loudly to be felt. The monotony of the sea carved strange thoughts into their minds. Men argued over what America would look like. Some imagined endless cities of glass and steel, where every man carried a gun. Others pictured barren plains patrolled by guards and wild dogs. Hans tried to picture it too, but the image never held. He only knew it would be different. Everything was already different. One evening, while the convoy pushed through calmer waters, the red-haired guard returned with something unexpected, a box of cigarettes. He tossed it down through the hatch. "Share," he said again, his voice rough with exhaustion. The men stared, hesitant. Carl picked one up, sniffed it, then lit it. He inhaled deeply, exhaled, and passed it to Hans. The smoke curled upward, toward the vent, thin and ghost-like. In that moment, the war felt far away. Hans thought of the stories he would tell if he ever went home. Stories about the desert, the capture, and now this ship that carried him into the unknown. He wondered whether anyone would believe him when he said the Americans gave them food, water, and even cigarettes. He suspected they wouldn't. Some lies are too comfortable to abandon. The days grew colder. The sea changed color, from brown to blue, from blue to gray-green, until it looked almost metallic. The smell shifted too. Less salt, more smoke. Hans could sense land before he saw it, the way animals sense storms. There was a hum in the air, a promise, a warning. Late one night, he woke to the sound of bells. Not alarms, but distant harbor bells carried by wind. He sat up, heart racing. Men stirred around him, whispering. A voice from above shouted in English, sharp but excited. They were close, closer than they'd been to anything real in weeks. When morning came, the hatch opened fully. Light flooded the hold, pure and merciless. The prisoners squinted, covering their eyes. For the first time since Africa, Hans saw the sky, wide, blue, and streaked with smoke. Then he heard a voice from above, clear and steady. "Welcome to America." The words hung in the air like a riddle. Welcome. To what? No one answered. They only climbed toward the light, step by step, leaving behind the darkness of the hold. And everything they had once believed. The ship creaked as it turned into harbor. Outside, unseen but near, the skyline of a nation waited, rising from mist and myth. The men said nothing, but their faces said everything. Fear, hope, disbelief. They had crossed an ocean, carried by the enemy they'd been taught to hate, and somewhere between the waves and the waking light, that hatred had begun to dissolve. They didn't know it yet, but the world waiting beyond that dock would challenge everything they thought they knew about strength, cruelty, and civilization itself. The sea finally quieted, but inside the ship another storm began, made of questions no one dared to ask aloud. The prisoners knew they were close. They could smell land now. Smoke, coal, the faint sweetness of roasted coffee drifting through the vents. After weeks of salt and metal, the new scent was almost unbearable. It smelled like life, yet life to them meant danger. Every rumor whispered across the Atlantic came back stronger now. America, they said, paraded its prisoners through streets like circus trophies. America locked men in cages and made them work until their hands bled. Some swore they had heard of camps built on frozen plains where no one ever returned. The imagination did the rest, turning uncertainty into terror. Hans could not stop thinking of the word the sailor had used when they left the hold. Welcome. Was it kindness or mockery? He repeated it under his breath, testing it on his tongue. Like a foreign coin. It felt strange, too soft to be real. Above deck, chains clanked, anchors rattled. Voices called out in English, quick and confident as the Liberty ship slid into harbor. From below came the shuffle of boots. Hundreds of men pressing toward the hatch, desperate for a first glimpse. The air grew warmer, heavier. Every breath tasted of coal smoke and fear. When the hatch finally groaned open, the light hit them, like a blow. For weeks they had lived by the dim glow of lamps. Now sunlight poured in, sharp and golden. It painted every face in disbelief. Hans blinked until tears burned his eyes. The sky above was enormous, impossibly clean, and beyond the railing cranes swung over docks crowded with workers. This was no ruined coastline, no starving nation clawing for survival. This was motion, rhythm, abundance. The men pressed closer, necks craning. They expected jeers, stones, something to prove the stories right. Instead, they heard only the mechanical thunder of industry, engines, whistles, shouts of laborers calling to one another. No hatred, no spectacle, just work. America was busy. Carl stood beside Hans, jaw tight. They build as if war doesn't exist, he muttered. Hans didn't answer. He couldn't. Everywhere he looked, there was evidence that contradicted everything he'd been told. Cargo piled high, trains waiting, soldiers in crisp uniforms laughing over mugs of coffee. He had imagined a land of monsters. He saw a land of motion. Then came the order to disembark. Guards lined the gangway, rifles ready but eyes calm. The prisoners moved slowly, step by step, until their boots touched solid ground. The plank beneath them trembled. The dock beneath it did not. For the first time in months, the earth felt steady. A line of American cooks waited by steaming pots. The smell made stomachs twist. Meat, onions, bread. No one moved until a guard barked, "Eat!" Metal trays appeared. Ladles poured generous helpings. Men hesitated, suspicious, but hunger won. Hans tasted the stew, hot and rich, and felt his throat tighten. He could not remember the last time food had warmth in it. Across from him, Carl ate silently, every bite a challenge to his own disbelief. Around them, the dock bustled. No mob, no cameras, only workers and soldiers performing their duties with indifferent precision. If anyone stared, it was with curiosity, not hatred. Some even smiled faintly, as though unsure what emotion was appropriate for an enemy so far from home. The prisoners were divided into groups. Each was counted, searched, and directed toward waiting trains. The carriages were not cattle wagons, but passenger cars refitted with benches and windows that actually opened. That small detail struck Hans harder than the food. Fresh air, windows, choice. He had expected darkness and chains. He found daylight and seats. As the train jerked forward, he pressed his forehead to the glass. Outside, the harbor slid past. Rows of cranes, warehouses, the silhouettes of ships unloading endless cargo. Farther back, beyond the docks, rose the skyline of a city glittering in morning light. So many windows, all unbroken. He thought of Munich, of Cologne, of the cities he had seen reduced to skeletons of stone. Here, there was no rubble, no smoke of war, only progress. A deep unease settled in him. If America could fight a war and still look untouched, what did that say about the world he had fought for? What did it say about everything he had believed? As the train clattered westward, the other prisoners began to talk, quietly at first, then with growing urgency. Some said this was a trick, a stage built to impress them before the cruelty began. Others, bolder, admitted their confusion aloud. How can a country so rich need to fight at all? One asked. No one had an answer. Hans watched factories give way to neighborhoods, neighborhoods to fields. Children played near fences, chasing dogs that barked at the passing train. A few waved. The prisoners stared back, too stunned to respond. Carl finally lifted his hand in a hesitant wave. To his surprise, a small boy waved harder, grinning until he vanished from view. That simple gesture, so ordinary, so human, felt heavier than any speech. The prisoners turned away from the windows, each retreating into private thought. No one wanted to say it, but all of them felt it. The ground beneath their certainty was crumbling. By dusk, the train had left the coast. Behind, through the windows stretched an endless landscape. Fields brushed gold by the setting sun, silos standing like monuments to plenty. The world outside was calm, ordered, alive. Inside, the prisoners sat in silence, trying to reconcile what they saw with what they had been told. When night fell, Hans closed his eyes but could not sleep. He kept hearing that single word, echoing from the dock, from the sailor's mouth weeks before. Welcome. Perhaps it had been a joke. Perhaps it had been sincere. Either way, it followed him into the dark like a promise he didn't yet understand. He whispered to Carl, half afraid of the answer. What if everything they told us was wrong? Carl didn't reply. He stared out at the passing lights of distant farmhouses and said softly, "Then we have a great deal to learn." Outside, the train thundered deeper into the continent. Behind them lay an ocean full of lies. Ahead waited a land that would unravel them one by one. They had rehearsed the moment in the dark holds in 100 different ways, each imagined horror more detailed than the last. But no rehearsal prepared them for the actual light. When Hans climbed the ladder and surfed up into the fresh air, the world hit him like a slap. Sunlight poured down in sheets. The air smelled not of fear but of movement. Smoke from boilers, the tang of tar, and under everything, a strong, ordinary sweetness, coffee. It was a smell that spoke of morning and routine, and, to men who had lived under ration lines and silence, it felt nearly obscene. Before the harbor fully revealed itself, there was only the sense of scale. Cranes like the ribs of enormous beasts, ships tied together like islands of industry, men moving with the certainty of purpose. There were no ruins, no lines of desperate civilians, only motion, precision, supply. It was, in one stunned moment, another planet. They stepped down the gangway in a line, boots echoing. An American sergeant barked a curt order, count, stack, move, and then a table of cooks leaned forward with steaming ladles. Trays clanged, men hesitated, hands hovering over the metal. The joke they'd expected, the parade of humiliation, didn't come. Instead, an American guard looked directly at Hans and said, in slow, careful German, "Essen, eat." Hans froze, the word landing somewhere between disbelief and relief. He looked at Carl, who had already taken his tray, then at the stew steaming in the bowl. Thick meat, potatoes, bread that didn't crumble when pressed. Carl tore into it with a kind of rude gratitude, spoon-scraping, eyes intent on the simple act of filling his stomach. Around them, other prisoners ate, some as if in punishment, others with a quiet hunger that made them almost weep. The food was the first, small crack in the wall of fears they carried. If America fed you, what did that imply? If their captors chose nourishment over torture, was cruelty a lie told to make courage easier to find? Questions like these were dangerous, softening questions in a world that demanded hard answers. But they opened anyway, like hairline fractures in old stone. Beyond the food, the harbor itself performed a slow rebuttal to their preconceptions. Stacks of crates marked with unfamiliar stamps, COCACOLA, SCHOOLS, UPPLIES, machinery, told a quiet story of abundance. Forklifts hummed, workers shouted orders, men in uniforms ate with civilians. Everything was moving, inexhaustible in a way that startled those who had watched Europe narrowed to ration cards and ruins. A group of sailors idly tossed a pack of cigarettes. Someone called down, "Share!" The cigarettes, like the stew, traveled from hand to hand, an odd currency exchanged not from contempt but from habit. Carl lit his and handed the smoke to Hans. They inhaled, the nicotine sharp and unfamiliar, and for a second the world felt oddly neighborly. A truck rolled by, piled high with canned goods. A woman on the dock, plain-faced, with flour on her. Hands paused to watch the procession of prisoners and waved her hand in a gesture so ordinary it stung. Some prisoners raised their trays in reflexive thanks. Others looked back, uncertain whether gratitude had a place in this new geography. They had been taught that the American people were monsters in suits. Here, a cook and a mother on the docks were simply human beings doing ordinary things. They were led to trains that would carry them inland. The cars were clean, benches solid, windows that opened to the country. As the train pulled away from the harbor, the skyline receded, giving way to bridges, orderly warehouses, and roads that moved like lines in a machine. Hans pressed his forehead to the glass and watched the city retreat, its noise replaced by the steady rhythm of rails and the soft pulsing of distant engines. Outside the train, America revealed itself in fragments. A boy on a porch with a paper, airplane, a woman sweeping her stoop, a parade of trucks moving like ants. In every frame there was life, abundant, routine, and to these men bewildering. Fields rolled by, large and unbroken, fat with crops. Silos rose like monuments to provision. Children chased one another in yards that were not bombed but built. Words were spoken quietly among the prisoners now, no longer hysterical rumors but questions being tested against sight. "Why am I surprised?" one asked. Another answered, "Because we were told to be." The idea that propaganda had been a map of lies was beginning to settle in their minds like a physical weight. Yet even in that breathless astonishment, there was caution. Men had been trained for deceit, schooled in suspicion. Small acts of kindness were often measured for a hidden hand. The American guard who had handed out trays did not smile. He did his job with the economy of someone who had seen too much and judged little. His kindness, if that's what it was, bore the same authority as a sentence. Steady, unromantic, and final. A rumor pulsed through their group that they might be shown off in parades, displayed as trophies or proof of victory. But as trains snaked further inland, that fear dwindled. At station stops, locals gathered, curiosity more than bile marked their faces. Some stared hard, their expressions unreadable. Others, especially children, waved without fear. An old man tipped his hat. A woman clapped her hands and laughed as a small child ran up to the fence to get a closer look. These gestures carried no malice, only a natural interest at something unfamiliar. On one small platform, a farmer offered a slice of apple pie to a prisoner under guard. He didn't offer it as charity. He thrust it forward like handing over the day's harvest, practical, human, without ceremony. The prisoner took it, ate slowly, and for the first time in months tasted something that wasn't rationed, something that belonged to the ordinary pleasures of life. Each bite seemed to dissolve a small piece of the old dread, yet the contrast cut both ways. As much as they saw generosity, they also began to notice boundaries, subtle, then sharper. Signs they did not understand, separate benches in some stations, a line where some were told to wait. The details whispered a complexity that would haunt them in months to come, a thriving nation that, for all its abundance, carried its own unevenness. For now, the first sight of America lodged in them like a seed, small, stubborn, and impossible to ignore. It would grow differently in each man. In Hans, a slow curiosity. In Carl, a guarded skepticism. In others, a longing that would follow them home. They had come expecting monsters and found instead a noisy, alive country that kept its machinery, running even in wartime. What they could not know then was how that image would sit against other, darker truths they would witness. Truths that would force them to reconcile admiration with dismay. As the train carried them inland, Hans held his tray with both hands like a talisman. He tasted the food again, letting the warmth settle, and thought almost aloud, if this is cruelty, then perhaps the word has a different meaning. Carl only glanced at him and said nothing. But the silence between them was no longer empty. It had the weight of questions beginning to be answered. Beyond the windows, America rolled on, unfazed, abundant, and bewildering in its normalcy. For the first time since capture, the prisoners felt something close to amazement. It was not joy, not yet. It was something quieter, the dawning realization that the world might be far more complicated than the stories that had carried them here. The train that carried them from the harbor felt like a machine built to erase distance. Windows framed a country that had never been reduced to ration cards or rubble, only the steady, ordinary movement of life. Inside the car, the prisoners rode in rows, shoulders touching, eyes on the passing landscape as if it were a foreign film played one frame at a time. At first, the motion was strange. Towns folded into one another without rubble, porches lined with chairs, children loose, and loud in yards where no sirens howled. Farmhouses stood neat and whole, their paint bright against fields that rolled and dipped like green oceans. Silos punctuated the horizon, not monuments of scarcity but of abundance, full to their crowns. Hans watched everything with the slow bafflement of a man who'd been taught a different map. He pressed his palm to the glass and felt the coolness under his skin, tried to hold the image like proof that the world outside could be true. Carl sat beside him, hands clasped, jaw set. He pointed out details in German names, church steeples, family cars, men walking with papers under their arms, and tried to catalog them as if a list might make them less impossible. The other prisoners reacted in private ways. Some laughed hollowly, as though finding humor was the only armor left. A few fell into silence so deep it was almost prayer. Others, braver or less broken, spoke in low voices about the farms, about how much work must be required to feed so many, and whether that meant the Americans had no fear of hunger at home. At every stop, the stations offered a small theater of the ordinary. Civilians milled on platforms, shopkeepers swept stoops, women argued over produce, children chased one another in the dust. When the train slowed, faces came to the windows like questions. The prisoners leaned out, and for the first time since capture, they were seen not as shadows or slogans but as men with tired eyes and uniforms that still smelled of the desert. An old man with a flour-dusted apron tipped his hat, and the gesture landed on Hans like a hand on the shoulder. Simple. Human. A little girl, hair tousled, pressed her nose to the glass and giggled as if looking at animals in a zoo. And a few prisoners found themselves laughing in return. It was absurd and small and entirely human. The war had not taught them how to react to ordinary kindness. On the third day, the train crested a gentle hill and opened onto a valley that seemed made for harvest. A line of men bent low in a field, backs working in unison as they harvested rows of corn. A tractor puffed beside them, tidy and efficient. The prisoners watched and, for an hour, forgot the roles that had been assigned to them. Soldier and captor, because all they saw were hands, soil, and a rhythm older than ideology. A guard checked the manifest and spoke to a farmer waiting at the station. The farmer merely nodded and pointed to a schedule on a clipboard. "Work assignments," the guard translated roughly, and the prisoners looked at one another with a mix of apprehension and curiosity. To some, the idea of manual labor carried the promise of humiliation. To others, it offered a strange dignity. Honest work, sunlight on the back, a chance to move instead of lie still. Hans's first impression of the American countryside was not merely its size, but the way people moved through it. Deliberate, practical, not frantic as in the ruined cities he had left behind. A woman, with a child strapped to her back, walked past a grocery with full shelves peeking through the window. A boy sold newspapers at a corner and waved to the passing train. Children were not scrawny. They were round-faced and cheeks flushed from play. When the prisoners were brought to the first work site, they found themselves under open sky rather than behind wire. Guards stood nearby, rifles slung, but the orders were simple. Pick clean, carry to the sacks, load the wagons. At first, the Germans bent their backs with suspicion, watching for trickery. Then, as the sun rose and sweat formed on the napes of their necks, they fell into the slowness of labor. There was a kind of rhythm to it, a work song of motion that needed no language. Lift, bend, pack, repeat. Hands that had once held rifles now learned to hold hoes and baskets. Farmers watched them with a practical eye. One older farmer, skin browned like old leather, did not speak much, but when he handed over a jug of lemonade at noon, his gesture was as natural as passing a tool. It had no ceremony and no condescension, only the simple relief of offering refreshment to hands that were earning their keep. That small jug traveled down a line of sweat-soaked men, each one taking a long, grateful drink before returning to the rows. Some prisoners bristled. They had been trained to see the world through slogans. Here the language did not translate. Others softened. There were quiet conversations in broken English, exchanges about weather, about children, about a football that someone explained was called baseball. A guard taught a man how to catch by miming the motion. The man, clumsy at first, managed a near catch and laughed. Genuine, startling laughter that seemed foreign in a time of war. When news reached some camps that prisoners were working on farms, the reaction was complex. Some families back home could not believe it. What sort of country would feed and employ its enemies? In conversations that would later be recounted in letters, men described shelves of stores, the unexpected sweetness of canned fruit, and the sight of children sitting calmly on porches while planes flew far above. Planes that did not reduce the towns to ash. Not every encounter was peaceful. There were cold stares and a few sharp words on porches where bereaved relatives remembered sons who never returned. In those moments, the men felt the weight of the world they had helped create. But the practical reality often overruled angry sentiment. Crops must be harvested, timber must be cut, factories needed hands. In that way, necessity became a kind of bridge. As days passed, the rhythm of work seeped into their lives. They woke to dawn and a roll call that sounded less like punishment and more like schedule. Mealtimes were steady, predictable. The boredom of free hours was filled with improvised games, with someone beating a rhythm on a crate, or another teaching a tune on a tin harmonica. Some found themselves making small things out of scrap, carvings, quick sketches, tiny attempts to make an enduring thing when so much of the world had been taken away. For Hans, work was both a balm and a challenge. He liked the simple authority of a task he could complete with his hands. There was a dignity in making a row of sacks neat, in seeing a pile of harvested beets lined up ready to go. Carl, more cautious, kept his feelings private but admitted, in private conversation, that the work was honest and that the Americans, those he saw on the farm, were not the caricatures he had been taught to fear. By the time the sun set on another day in the fields, the prisoners returned to camp dusty and exhausted, but quieter in a way that suggested thoughtfulness rather than defeat. Some had traded small things with guards, buttons, a carved figurine, a story or two. Friendship, where it formed, was cautious and practical, often spoken without deep words, but with small gestures that meant more than language could. The journey inland had done something that the sea could not. It gave them context. America was no longer a myth on the horizon. It was a place where people worked, argued, laughed, and fed their children. It was ordinary in ways that struck the prisoners harder than spectacle ever could. And ordinary, they discovered, could be as disconcerting as any storm. When the gates clanged shut, the reality of captivity settled into a rhythm. Barbed wire framed the sky like a stubborn question. Inside, the camps were neither hell nor haven. They were a world remade by rules, strict, mundane, and strangely humane. Morning began with roll call, the scrape of boots, the register of names. Men lined up in rows, numbers counted, voices measured. It was a procedure that ate uncertainty and replaced it with routine. Routine, in time of war, is a mercy. It hands a man something he can predict, and predictability keeps fear from growing teeth. Meals marked the hours. Trays passed down canteens, portions steady and reliable. Meat, potatoes, bread, coffee. It was not luxury, but it was nourishment. Consistent, warm, bewildering to men who had known hunger as a daily companion. For many, the 3 meals a day were the clearest evidence that the stories of cruelty were false. They had been taught to expect starvation. Instead, they found regularity. Work followed inside the camp and out. Some were assigned to kitchen details, others to fence repair, others to workshops where they learned trades or practiced old ones. There were lectures, language classes, basic civics, even courses in practical farming. For prisoners who had been soldiers by training and artisans by blood, the tasks offered both distraction and small pride. A repaired chair, a carved toy, a clean stove. And there was sport. Open fields became makeshift pitches. Soccer, a fierce and universal language, reappeared like a memory. Teams formed quickly. Rivalries flared. Cheers rose over the wire. On game days, the camp looked less like a prison and more like a town gathering. Laughter, unexpected and raw, drifted across the barracks and surprised everyone who heard it. Music threaded through the camp in other ways. Choirs formed. A violin relearned an old hymn. An accordion wheezed out a tinny tune. On warm evenings, men gathered and listened to songs that smelled of home. Those melodies carried farther than guards or walls. They traveled back to the private places inside men and reminded them they had lived before the uniform defined them. Not everything was soft. Discipline was strict and escapes were punished swiftly. Guards kept watch from towers. Rifles were a constant punctuation to the day. The wire was a reminder that any kindness existed inside boundaries. Freedom could be as close as a field beyond the fence and as far as a country across an ocean. The camps also held their own politics. Not all prisoners were the same. Some clung to the old loyalties, founding secret meetings to maintain belief and punish dissent. Others, worn by battle and doubts, began to question the ideology that had sent them into the world to kill and be killed. Arguments broke out in dim corners, words sharpened by months of hunger and lies. One man might argue that surrender was betrayal. Another would call for reading newspapers and learning new things. Those disputes sometimes escalated into violence, and the camp staff had to intervene to keep order. Still, for all the tensions, an uneasy civility took root. Conversations between guard and prisoner, though limited and wary, became more common. Some guards traded cigarette rations for small carved figures. Others taught a word of English for a line of German. They did not become friends. Few did. But an understanding emerged. Each man behind his uniform was human and exhausted. Letters were a lifeline. Red Cross mail arrived in bundles, censored and slow. But each envelope was a bridge to another life. Prisoners opened letters with hands that trembled. Sometimes with joy when news of a living mother arrived, sometimes with sorrow for towns reduced to ash. The letters were measured, careful. Men knew what could be printed and what could not. Yet between the lines they tried to tell the truth. The gardens they had tended, the songs sung at dusk, the small kindnesses that stitched the camp together. Art sustained many, Sketching, carving, painting, men reached for creation as if to prove they still existed beyond their prisoner numbers. A woodcarver from Saxony whittled small figures that he traded for extra tobacco. A painter copied the view from a washhouse and sent the small canvas home as proof he had seen a sky like that. Those objects would later surface in attics and museums as quiet testaments to resilience. Religion, too, sustained some and divided others. Inside the barracks, makeshift services formed, men gathering around a single Bible or an improvised altar, songs half-remembered and prayers mumbled under breath. For others, the chapel offered no solace. The war had emptied the old faith of its certainties. Yet even among the unbelieving, ritual, roll call, the evening light, the shared meal, became a secular sort of sacrament, binding men into a fragile social fabric. Tensions with pro-Nazi factions were real and dangerous. Those loyal to the Reich sometimes enforced their own order, shunning or threatening fellow prisoners who questioned the cause. These internal policing acts mirrored in microcosm the fractures tearing Germany apart back home. It was a bitter irony that in captivity, some men continued to perpetuate the same cruelty they had been condemned for. Every so often, a quiet act cut through the strangeness. A guard who lingered to listen to a soldier's memory. A local family who dropped a parcel of fruit at the gate. A midday film screening that made men laugh until they wept. These small intersections were the threads that rewove humanity between fences and towers. Yet always, at the edge of these moments, the wire waited. Men knew the kindnesses had limits. They were grateful, but they were not blind. The guards could be strict as law, and the world beyond the fence was not the world behind them. The wire defined a line not only of land but of identity. Prisoner on one side, citizen on the other. By night, in the dim light of bunks, conversations turned inward. What would happen after the war? Would families be there to take them back? Could a man who had learned to work in American fields return to a country of rubble and suspicion? Questions multiplied without answers. That uncertainty sat heavy, a companion to sleep and waking. Still, the daily rhythm gave space for thought, and for small change. Some men began to soften their ideas of the enemy. It was not an immediate conversion. It was a slow and quiet persuasion, seated in shared work in a bowl of stew and the sound of a violin at dusk. For Hans, the change was gradual. He did not write his beliefs down. He lived them in small decisions, a cigarette shared, a word taught, a hand offered. When another stumbled, the camp with its rules and routines was not redemption. It was containment. But within containment, something else was happening. Men were encountering the stranger within the stranger. That meeting would not erase the past, but over time it would complicate it, making the simple maps of propaganda look, finally, like lies drawn in dust. The work was the part that felt most like penance, and most like a lifeline. They were no longer only prisoners scheduled for roll call. They were hands needed under the sun. When the orders came, pick, load, harvest, mend, the movements were mechanical at first, then muscle remembered what it meant to be useful. It was honest labor, unadorned and relentless, and for many men it was the first steady thing they'd done in months. Hans learned quickly that the rhythm of work could quiet a mind. A row of beats to be lifted, a sack to be filled, the same. Motion repeated until the task was done. These small certainties calmed the most raw anxieties. The field smelled of earth and sweat. The sky overhead was a constant blue that offered no accusations, only weather. At noon, a farmer would pass a large jug and call, "Drink up," and the men would take long gulps that patched 1,000 small famines at once. Payment existed, oddly and practically, not as wages to retire a debt, but as small allowances for canteens. The majority went to the American government to cover upkeep, yet each man received a few cents a week that turned into cigarettes, sugar, candy, or a bar of soap. For some, it was ridiculous. For others, it was scandalous. Pocket. Money earned while their brothers at home scraped for bread. Still, that tin of sweets became a private treasure. A piece of chocolate passed between men could become an entire conversation. The canteens were small economies. Men traded, bartered, and saved. A carved wooden figurine might be exchanged for 2 cigarettes. A sketch of a farmhouse could buy a portion of jam. These transactions were as much about dignity as they were about goods. Proof that these men could make and exchange value even when their futures were uncertain. Work brought practical interactions with Americans, farmers, factory foremen, townspeople, each encounter shaped by necessity and, sometimes, by unexpected decency. The farmer who supervised Hans on the beet fields did not speak much English. Hans's German answered the gestures and the nods. At the end of a long, blistering day, the farmer handed out lemonade in an aluminum jug. He did not ask for thanks. He offered what he had, and that ordinary generosity stayed with Hans for years. Not every meeting softened into kindness. Some faces on porches carried grief that would not be soothed by an extra pair of hands. A woman might stare with the hard, hollow look of someone who had lost a son. A man might spit words of accusation as the prisoners passed. There were towns where the welcome was thin and cold, where the presence of captured soldiers reopened wounds that had not healed. Those moments reminded the prisoners that labor did not erase the past. It only put daylight on the ways people survived after loss. Factories offered a different sort of labor, loud, soot-dark, and precise. In metal shops, they learned how to unbolt and weld, to pack parts into crates bound for distant fronts. The tai rhythm here was faster, the stakes higher. A broken part could mean a delay in supplies, and delays could mean lives. The supervisors were strict but practical. Get the work done right, and you keep moving. Some prisoners prized those factory skills after the war, quiet trades that became a way to rebuild a life. There were odd rituals of normalcy stitched into the workday, coffee breaks taken under shade trees, baseball games organized by guards. On the weekends where prisoners watched or fumbled with the bat, laughter that rose, sudden and disarming. Small comforts, ice cream on a rare hot afternoon, a taste of Coca-Cola, arrived like relics from a world that ran differently from the one they had left. A first sip of soda hit like a miracle. The fizz, the cold, the sugar were details German. Mouths had nearly forgotten could exist outside propaganda and shortage. Language was both a barrier and a bridge. Broken English exchanged for bits of German, names of tools, words for faster or careful, built a fragile vocabulary of cooperation. Sometimes a guard would stop to teach a phrase. Sometimes an elderly farmer would point to a field, and with a few laboring gestures, show how to lift a crate. These small lessons were practical, but they carried a moral lesson too. Shared labor made people legible to each other. Occasionally, a prisoner would be allowed supervised errands to a nearby town. These trips felt like a treacherous freedom. Under guard, they walked past store windows piled high with goods. Sugar, soap, fruit. Shelves that, to men who had seen empty counters, looked obscene. On one such walk, Hans remembered pushing a cart where a child in a small dress waved at him without fear. For a moment, the world tilted. The child's smile did not ask whether he'd killed or been kind. She did not know the names of his sins. Humanity, it seemed, could endure in the smallest smiles. Not every town offered smiles. There were places where a glance turned to a glare, where a caller on the street flung an epithet like a stone. Those moments hardened something in the men, a protective shell grown from years of hearing only the loudest narratives. Yet even then, other hands reached out. An old woman passing a wrapped loaf at the market stall, a shopkeeper offering a job to a man who could hammer wood. These contradictions threaded through the workdays, forming a new, complicated geography, a feeling. Inside the camps, work shifted into culture. Choirs, drawings, carved tokens, makeshift theaters. Evenings were when the day's labor settled into stories. Men told tales of their families, of harvests past, of celebrations that had once been normal. They swapped recipes as if swapping memories. They taught each other songs that had been buried by war. Art and craft became proof against erasure. Proof that they were not merely numbers, but makers of meaning. Most powerful of all was the way work taught some men to see themselves differently. A bootmaker who had once mended a Feldwebel's leather now fixed soles for a farmer's boy. A carpenter who had built a barracks bench later carved a toy for a child on a porch. The act of making shifted identity from soldier to worker, from enemy to participant in a life that continued regardless of flags. Yet the wire always waited. No amount of harvested crops could undo the fact of detention. No amount of canned fruit could erase the bomber's smoke back home. Work softened edges without smoothing them. It taught lessons about dignity, utility, and the strange moral economy of kindness under guard. For Hans, the fields were a teacher, and for Karl, they were a mirror. Hans found purpose in the daily tasks. Karl returned from the rouse with more questions than answers. Both carried a new, uncomfortable knowledge that the enemy who fed them and needed their hands could also be imperfect in ways they had not imagined. That realization would later force them, and the men around them, to look harder at their own country and at the language they had used to justify war. When the harvests ended and trains came to carry them back to camp, they left behind neat stacks of sacks and a few exchanged gifts, carved whistles, a scrap of a newspaper folded into a small packet of memory. They left with muscles tired but proud, and with a private ledger of kindness and scorn that no official report would ever fully record. By the time the prisoners had grown used to America's abundance, the food, the fairness, the routines, they began to notice something else. It began quietly, with signs. Words painted on wooden boards, letters carved above doorways, separate benches in bus depots, separate fountains in parks. At first they didn't understand. Then someone translated, white and colored. The revelation was slow, then sharp. The same country that had fed its enemies full meals, that handed them work and wages, divided its own people by color. To men who had been raised on propaganda about America's moral collapse, it was a strange, unsettling paradox. They had expected cruelty and found kindness. Now they saw kindness wearing a mask. One afternoon, Hans stood in a line at a depot in Georgia, waiting for a supply truck. Across the street, black American soldiers, wearing the same uniform as their guards, waited in another line. Their portions were smaller, their tables separate, their laughter quieter, wary. The prisoners were served first. The guards said nothing, pretending not to notice the contradiction. But Hans did. He looked at the food in his hands, then at the men in uniform across the way, and felt a shame he could not name. Later that night he whispered to Karl, "We are the enemy, and they treat us better than their own." Karl stared at the floorboards. Maybe that's how power works. It always needs someone below. Neither spoke again for a long time. In the barracks, arguments flared. Some men said the scene proved that the propaganda had been right, that America was hypocritical, rotten under its shine. Others disagreed. They saw in the contradiction not hypocrisy, but humanity, an unfinished country capable of mercy and injustice at once. The debates lasted deep into the night, the wire glowing under moonlight while men wrestled with the meaning of fairness. A guard once overheard a question from Hans. "Why is it this way?" The guard paused, jaw tight, then muttered, "Because it's always been." That answer did nothing to resolve the confusion, it deepened it. The prisoners began to understand that power was never simple, not even in victory. These contradictions followed them everywhere. On some farms, black laborers worked side by side with German prisoners, but not beside the white owners. At one, psyched when a German fainted from heat, it was a black field hand who ran first, shaded the man with his hat, and gave him water. No words passed between them, yet the gesture remained engraved in memory. For the Germans who witnessed it, that act was the quietest, clearest lesson they would ever learn about dignity. Some guards felt the irony too. A black American sergeant once watched the prisoners eat, then walked away before taking his own meal. One German whispered, "He wears the same flag. Why not the same respect?" No one answered. The contradiction did not destroy what the prisoners had begun to learn. It complicated it. They had seen that America could feed its enemies, that mercy could exist in power. Now they saw that even the merciful could be unjust. The world they had believed in, where nations were either righteous or corrupt, was gone. What replaced it was harder to grasp, a truth made of opposites. Hans tried to write about it in a letter home. He described the meals, the fields, the kindness, and then carefully the separation he had seen. He wrote, "They are strong, but not perfect. They feed us and yet divide themselves. They win wars, but they do not win fairness." The censor's black ink would later blot out that last sentence. Within the camps, this moral confusion became a quiet education. It taught them that ideology, any ideology, simplifies too much. That every country carries its own shadow. It did not excuse their own country's crimes. It made them harder to defend. A few men began to see Germany's propaganda for what it had been, a mirror designed to blind. For others, the contradictions became a refuge. They told themselves, if America is also unjust, then no one is pure. It was easier to rest in cynicism than to confront guilt. But for Hans, cynicism wasn't enough. He had seen too many small mercies to let despair explain everything. One night near the fence, he met a black soldier on patrol. The man stopped, nodded, and offered a cigarette through the wire. They smoked in silence, two men in uniforms chosen for them by fate. No conversation, no translation. When the cigarette burned down to the filter, the soldier said softly, "War ends, but people don't change easy." Hans nodded. "Maybe they can try." The soldier smiled faintly. "That's the trick." Then he walked away. It was the smallest of exchanges, yet Hans carried it for decades. It told him that empathy existed not in nations, but in individuals, each man deciding whether to see or to turn away. Inside the wire, the contradiction never left. Prisoners debated it in whispers, their words mixing with the hum of the guard lights. They spoke of justice, of hypocrisy, of the strange mercy that had saved them. They had arrived believing in absolutes, good nations, evil nations, the pure and the damned. But behind the barbed wire, those lines blurred. They began to understand that strength was not the same as virtue, and cruelty not the same as victory. That fairness could exist beside injustice, and humanity could survive inside contradiction. It was an education no classroom could have given, and one that would outlast the war itself. In the end, America's contradictions did not weaken what the prisoners had learned. It made the lesson real. It proved that mercy was not born from perfection but from choice, that even a flawed nation could choose to feed its enemies, even while denying equality to its own. That realization became the hinge on which their understanding of the world began to turn. By the winter of 1944, whispers of Germany's collapse had reached the camps. The war that had started as ideology was ending as exhaustion. And as the prisoners waited for news from home, the contradictions of America, the kindness and the cruelty, the justice and the injustice, became the lens through which they would remember everything. The world, they now knew, was neither villain nor savior. It was human. When the war ended, it did not end cleanly. It faded, slowly, unevenly, like a fire that refused to die. The guns silenced before the hearts that had learned to live by them. For the prisoners, the news arrived in fragments. Rumors first, then official bulletins, then a guard's solemn face saying words that no one fully believed. Germany has surrendered. The war is over. Some wept. Some sat still, stunned by the absence of orders. Others laughed, sharp, brittle laughter that bordered on grief. For years they had been told the Reich was eternal. Now eternity had collapsed into silence. In the weeks that followed, the camps changed. The wire remained, but the guards' voices softened. Work continued, but the urgency drained away. There were no more roll calls at dawn, only counts at dusk to mark time until departure. Freedom, after so long, felt abstract, something heard about, not felt. Hans spent his evenings staring through the fence at the fields they had harvested. They were full again, green and ordered. He wondered who would work them next year. He wondered whether his own village, half a world away, still had fields to tend. News trickled in like distant weather. Cities gone, homes leveled, friends missing. The letters that did arrive were written on scavenged paper, full of gaps and evasions. We are alive, one might say. Or the house still stands, mostly. Sometimes there was nothing at all. The silence from home was its own kind of ruin. Repatriation came not as a rush, but a slow unraveling. Ships were scarce, and the world was crowded with displaced souls. Men left in groups, their names read like farewells. Those who stayed behind watched the trains go, each departure pulling a thread from the fabric of the camp until it felt almost hollow. Freedom was coming, yet no one cheered. Too much waited beyond the fences. When Hans's turn came, he packed his few belongings. A carved figure, 2 letters, a photograph of the fields. Carl folded a drawing of the Kansas farm they had worked on and slipped it inside a tin box. They did not speak much on the journey to the coast. What was there to say? They had left as soldiers, spent their years as prisoners, and were returning as something in between. The ship that carried them home was quieter than the one that had brought them. No fear of torpedoes now, only the heavy weight of thought. The ocean stretched out, gray and endless as before. But it was not the same. They were not the same. At night, the men sat on deck watching the horizon. Some sang softly, others smoked in silence. A few told stories, not of battles but of the strange mercy they had found. Hans spoke little. When he did, it was only to say they fed us. They could have done worse, but they fed us. It was not gratitude, it was testimony. Back in Germany, the homecoming was both joy and wound. Villages still stood, but thinner. Streets were filled with rubble, faces with weariness. Children stared at the returning men as if they were ghosts. Families embraced, wept, and asked the questions no one wanted to answer. What had you seen? What had you done? What had you become? Hans's mother was alive, thinner but alive. He told her about the farms, the meals, the guards who had laughed without hatred. She listened with disbelief. You were their prisoner, she said softly. And they fed you meat? Hans nodded. Every day. She shook her head. It sounds like a dream. He did not argue. Dreams were easier to believe than mercy. Carl struggled more. Restless in post-war Germany, he found the ruins intolerable. The gray hunger, the suspicion that clung to every conversation. Years later, he applied to emigrate, returning to the very land that had once imprisoned him. He built a small life in the Midwest, a family, a shop. When asked about the war, he would answer quietly, "The first time I saw America, I was a prisoner. The second time, I was free." And then he would change the subject. For those who stayed, the memories lived like ghosts. Private, persistent, unshareable. How could you tell neighbors digging through rubble that your captors had given you bread and kindness? How could you describe a country where enemies shared cigarettes and laughter drifted across the wire? To speak it aloud sounded like betrayal. And so most did not. They carried the story quietly like a stone in the pocket, unseen but always felt. Years passed. The war became a history book. The camps were dismantled, the fences cut down, the fields replanted. Only fragments remained. A carved figure in an attic, a faded letter, a photograph of men smiling in uniforms that once marked them as foes. Museums would later display these relics tidy and captioned, as proof of a curious fact, that mercy had existed in the midst of war. But for the men who had lived it, the lesson was not a museum piece. It was the core of their memory. Hans grew old. He never again wore a uniform. He worked quietly as a schoolteacher, teaching children about history without raising his voice. He told them to read carefully, to question everything, especially the stories that made enemies simple and wars glorious. When his grandson once asked him, "Opa, what did you learn as a prisoner?" Hans took a long time to answer. Finally he said, "That dignity is stronger than hatred, and that mercy, even small, can outlive empires." At night, by the fireplace, He sometimes spoke softly to himself, as if to the past. I saw America first as an enemy, then as a mirror. The flames flickered, and the years folded into silence. In the end, his memories were not about victory or defeat, but recognition. The understanding that humanity survives even where it shouldn't, that it hides in gestures, a ladle of stew, a jug of lemonade, a shared cigarette through wire. That mercy does not erase cruelty, but it interrupts it, and in that interruption, something sacred begins. The story of those prisoners is not about glory or shame. It is about how men who had been told to hate discovered that decency can exist even on the other side of a rifle, and how a nation, flawed but generous, showed its strength not through conquest, but through restraint. As the last embers of that war dimmed, one truth endured. You can defeat an army with weapons, but you disarm hatred with humanity. And sometimes, that quiet victory is the one that lasts longest.